Hello there, and welcome to Section 3 of Chapter 35 of American World War II for the American Pageant. This covers for U.S. history, any U.S. history in high school or even college. Today we're talking about the Allied halting of Hitler to D-Day, June 6, 1944. Got quite a bit to do, so we're going to get right into it. So we're shifting to the European theater. The previous video on Section 2 was on the Japanese theater. We're not going to completely finish either one. We'll come back to them. So Donald Nelson, the guy in the picture here, he was the war production head, brought in Simon Kuznets for logistics on how just getting everyone supplied, getting their guns or uniforms, and then the shipping of it, the material, all the logistics to supply and feed 15 million soldiers. Simon Kuznets, who's pictured here, was so smart. He actually won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1971. His recommendation, which was controversial, especially to Stalin, was to delay D-Day by 1 year. That the invasion of France should not start in 1943. The ABC-1 agreement said that July 1st, 1943, the Allies were going to invade France. Britain and the United States would invade France. Stalin was desperate for a second front, but Stalin was doing pretty well. By 1942 or 41-42, it's kind of a deadlock there. The war is vicious. And so they know that the manpower, the amount of Soviet troops could hold off the Nazis in the meantime. And then also he recommended scaling back to 90 divisions. Remember, it took 215 divisions of what they wanted for the invasion of France. So that's cutting it more than half. Each division is 20,000 people. Instead of 4.3 million men fighting in France, they're going to go with 1.8 million. It's kind of the division. And like I said, without the Soviets, there's no way this would work. So they're going to leave the other men back home to work in the factories. They need the manpower. They need to be able to produce all the materials, not just for the U.S., but for the British, for the Chinese in the Pacific War, and of course the Soviet Union, who using their manpower and the arsenal of democracy are the ones really inflicting heavy damage and heavy death toll on the Nazis. And so this is called the 90 Division Gamble, which is kind of a little known fact that the U.S. did this, which infuriates Stalin. He doesn't know really the ins and outs of this, but the fact that they delayed it makes Stalin distrust the Allies, and it kind of sows the seeds eventually which would become the Cold War. So in the actual fighting, the U.S. did have troops arrive in the European theater. They didn't really want to invade France yet. They delayed it by a year, so they decide, let's test the military out. Let's get our first engagements under our belt, get our feet wet in North Africa. Stalin, like I said, screaming his head off for an invasion of Europe. FDR and Churchill going, we're not ready for that. We're going to go to North Africa instead. The Nazis there are led by the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, who's winning stunning victory after victory. He's taking more and more places and pushing eastward across the Sahara, across the North African coast, towards Egypt and towards the Suez Canal, which was vital for shipping for the British and for the European theater between Asia and India and Europe. And so if they captured the Suez Canal, the Nazis could then potentially go and take Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, with the precious oil fields which the Nazis desperately needed for their Wehrmacht. The key battle of the North African campaign is El Alamein, or El Alamein, depending on how you pronounce it. This is November 1942. This is where the British finally stopped the Nazi advance in Egypt, led by General Bernard Montgomery, and stopped them from potentially pushing on to capture the Suez Canal and those precious oil fields of the Middle East. It's the first major defeat of the Nazis by the British, and so it's kind of a boost to morale that they were able to do this. At this point, the first Americans are arriving. This is almost a year after Pearl Harbor, and these are the men that were in the peacetime draft that have been training. They arrived in Algeria and Morocco. They're very green, which means inexperienced in our lingo. They're led by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Also, you have George S. Patton serving there, he's a kooky guy. He believed he was the reincarnation of Hannibal, the guy that invaded Rome using elephants. When he was in what would have been Carthage in that area, he believed like he had been there before. He had pearl-handled six-shooters or revolvers with his initials in them. He got a dog during the war named Rommel. He's just a kook. We'll talk more about him in a little bit. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was a disaster for the Allies. They got humiliated by the Nazis, and so because of this, they promote George S. Patton, who was a soldier's kind of general. He was out there fighting. He inspired them. They always fought hard. He was controversial, which we'll learn about in the Sicily campaign. And from there, with his leadership, they drove the Germans out in May 1933. May 1943 with the victory of El Guerreta. I cannot roll my R's, I'm sorry. I never could do it in Spanish class either. So here's kind of what's going on here. This is the Battle of El Alamein. So you had the Italians and the Nazis controlling most of North Africa, and it's here that the British stopped that advance. And from this area here, the British pushed the Nazis back across North Africa. The Americans landed in Algeria, eventually in Tunisia. The headquarters was at Casablanca, and from there they pushed out the Nazis. They were defeated at Kasserine Pass. They did win at El Guertar. Maybe I spelled that last one wrong. And then from there, they pushed them out through Tunisia. Here's another little map. It's kind of grainy. It was called Operation Torch. The first Americans landed on November 8th, 1942. This is the Battle of Kasserine Pass. The Allied defeat there. They were surrounded by the Nazis. And so it didn't work out well. And because of that, Patton was promoted. From there, you also have the battle on the high seas. A lot of material was being sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. Americans were working hard. They were building new aircraft, new tanks, you name it, and the U-boats were destroying them and sinking them and killing Allied shippers and all that. You had U-boats, German Nazi submarines lurking off the coast of the United States, sinking ships very close to New York City, down in the Gulf of Mexico and near South America. And so these shipping lanes were protected by the Allied navies. And eventually, through just grit, determination, air patrols, radar, eventually they win the Battle of the Atlantic. By the point that 1944, the Atlantic Ocean is basically cleared of all U-boats, where it used to be incredibly dangerous, and they're sinking a high percentage of ships. Now, by 1944, it's safe to ship. And these little circles here kind of shows the air bases that kind of they escorted and they helped out the shipping lanes, and they used the convoy system just like World War One, because they could spot submarines from up above, and they could drop depth charges and torpedoes and things like that to try to help save the day. Big thing that happened there going on. Also, you have the air war going over Germany. The British and the Americans are using strategic bombings. They're pounding German factories, German cities. The Americans would fly during the day. The British would fly during night. The first successful raid on rail yard or use of strategic bombing was in Rouen, France, August 17, 1942. B-17 bombers attacked this rail yard. It was successful, and they thought that they could prevent a lot of invasion. They could save a lot of lives by strategic bombing. Ironically, and maybe it's just a weird twist in history, it proved that strategic bombing would work. Paul Tibbets led this first raid. The first use of strategic bombing during the war was led by Paul Tibbets. If that name sounds familiar, well, he's the guy that captains the Enola Gay that eventually dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. So the first strategic bombing mission and the second to last, led by the same guy. These killed thousands. They were trying to break the morale of the people. And it brings out the worst in America, that they're bombing civilians, they're bombing targets that don't really have any military value. And it's kind of a sad, disgusting part of World War II. Many people call it the Good War, and it should not be called that. I mean, it really is just an evil war that brings out terrible things from both sides. 30,000 Germans were killed in the fire bombings of Hamburg, the fire bombings of Dresden, which had no military value at all, killed 30,000 people, which was immortalized in the Kurt Vonnegut book, Slaughterhouse-Five. Dresden was known as an artistic city for its architecture. It'd be like somebody destroying New Orleans or Las Vegas for no reason. No military significance at all. The British were flying night raids. They couldn't see their targets, so they were largely just hitting whatever. And that led to the eventual, earlier in the war, the retaliation of the Nazis against Britain. The Battle of the Blitz, or Battle of Britain, the Blitz, bombing London 57 straight days. The Americans flew day raids. They could see their targets, but the enemy could fight back. And so the Americans' casualty rates were a lot higher. The bomber's lifespan was 7 missions in 1943 until the invention of this plane here. The P-51s changed everything. They were a tough plane. They could match the German fighters, and they flew as protectors to these big, giant bombers. This long-range fighter was used as bait to lure the fighters out and to destroy the Luftwaffe so the Americans could gain control of the skies. And so the P-51 Mustang, as they're called, wonderful planes, saved lives, and turned the tide of the war. They cleared the skies for the D-Day invasion and for more and more bombings over Germany. This kind of shows the range. From most of the bombings, especially of Germany, were staged from Britain, and it kind of showed their operational range. The bombers from North Africa, they could get to southern Germany, a lot of all over Italy. The same kind of here in these other parts of North Africa and Libya and Egypt. And then once they invaded Italy, which we'll get to later in the videos, then they could really do some damage over the Nazis. This is a video of the firebombing of Dresden. You can look it up on YouTube. It's pretty good. The Eastern Front, though, is the real war. This is where the war is won or lost, depending on what side you're on. It's vicious, ferocious combat. It's a war without mercy. It's a war. It's a racial war of sorts, and it's terrible. I mean, the casualty rates are alarming. They're unprecedented. There's nothing like it in history. As I stated in previous videos, Leningrad or St. Petersburg was besieged for 900 days. The people were so desperate they were eating sawdust. They were eating the leather out of their couches, and people were on the brink of starvation. The siege was broken in 1944, and they battled back. The Nazis got to the outskirts of Moscow, and then Russian winter hit, and then the Soviets launched their counterattack. And then the Germans pushed south. They did take Kiev, but they were pushing towards the oil fields in the south, where Hitler got obsessed with one city in particular. He just wanted to rub it in his enemy's face. The city named after Joseph Stalin, Stalingrad. And so Stalin, he was very upset by the delay of the campaign to invade France. He said, "You Americans want to fight this war with American money, American machines, and Russian men." And he's right. When you look at the casualty numbers, it's astounding. The United States fought valiantly, don't get me wrong, but they lost 410,000 men in World War II. That's the Pacific and Europe combined. The Soviets, it's estimated, lost 20 million. 20 million, even more possibly in some areas. So the key battle in the east is Stalingrad. The Nazis, obsessed with this city because Hitler demanded it to be taken at all costs, got into urban conflict. Instead of using their wide area of big plains where they could use their tanks, their airplanes, their machines, they're now fighting street corner to street corner. Urban fighting, some of the slowest, most tedious, and dangerous types of fighting in war. But Hitler demanded that the city be taken at all costs, and so he pours everything he has in the region into taking Stalingrad. Stalin, not wanting to be embarrassed, does the same thing. And so the Soviets, they issue a stand your ground kind of order. Basically, anyone that retreated would be shot by their own commanding officers. There was no retreating. The commander of one of the forces in Stalingrad was Nikita Khrushchev, actually. The Soviets were lacking a lot of weapons, and so at some point they would partner people up. They'd give one guy bullets, another guy guns, and they'd say, go into battle and get together. And one guy would give the bullets to the guy with the gun, and he would just run behind. If the guy got shot, he'd pick up the gun and fight as well. Just as the Germans had fought after months and months to get to the center of the city, the Soviets surrounded them with another force. This is February 1943. The Soviets employed extensive amounts of snipers. There's some really good stories about snipers. There's good movies like Enemy at the Gates. It's been portrayed in Call of Duty. It's estimated there was 1.7 to 2 million casualties, which is insane. It's just this one battle is the deadliest battle in the history of mankind. The Soviets at that point launched a counteroffensive all across the Soviet Union. The green here shows the extent of the Nazis, their push. And then, you have kind of pushback in September 1941, and then, later on, December 1941, and then they're pushing towards Germany. To put it in perspective, the Soviets lost more men every 3 months in this war than America did in all of our wars combined. I'm going to repeat that one because it's astounding. Every 3 months of this war in World War II, the Soviets lost more men than all of our wars combined. The Soviets won the war in Europe. It's a video of this. From there, the Americans decided, let's invade Italy. We're right here, the British, and they decided, we got all the stuff. Let's just a little hop, skip, and a jump across the Mediterranean. We're not ready for an invasion of France, which really irritates Stalin. Go back to his quote. They took Sicily in the summer of 1943. It's at this point that Patton actually is suspended. He slapped a soldier who was recovering from what we would call PTSD now, but he slapped him and was suspended. From there, they take the mainland, and they're kind of pushing this two-pronged attack, trying to get all the way up to Rome. At this point, Mussolini is overthrown by the Italians. Hitler does this daring rescue where they send in troops to save him. They bring him up to northern Italy. And the Nazis fall behind the famed Gustav Line, which is almost impenetrable, and it really slowed the advance of the Americans in 1943. You can see that they had paratroopers who landed in Sicily, the British and the Americans. The Americans fought around the island, kind of moving towards the north and heading east. The British went this way. It was a race to get to Messina, and then to get to the mainland. And from there, you can see some of the battles, and then they jumped across, trying to attack them. The Gustav Line is here, which was this defense network, and the Americans are trying to fight through it. And there's fierce resistance to break through. The Americans incorrectly thought that the Nazis fortified the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino, and they bombed it. Oops. We helped rebuild it afterwards, you know. The Marshall Plan fixed it, but we bombed a centuries-old monastery. Oops. It's in this realm of the war that we get the 10th Mountain Division, which trained in Colorado near Leadville and Camp Hale. And they saw a lot of action in the mountains of Italy. Kind of a neat local history thing if you're from Colorado. In January 1944, the Allies launch a second amphibious invasion of the port of Anzio, which is a disaster. They get pinned down for 4 months. They suffer high casualties. And it's so badly planned that it's really the blueprints on how to invade France. It shows what not to do in the D-Day invasion that would be coming. Eventually, the Allies break through. They liberate Rome by June 1944. And then the Nazis fall back to another line of defense called the Gothic Line in northern Italy for the rest of the war. And Italy actually switches sides and joins the Allies at that point. Italy's a bandwagon fan. This is fun. This is from the Hoover Institute. This was a message received by pigeons in 1944 to the 36th Infantry Division. These Germans wrote this to the Americans. You poor night watchmen, here is pigeon number 2 back so that you won't starve. What do you plan in front of Casino with your tin can armor? Your captured syphilitic comrades have shown us the quality of American soldier. Your captains are too stupid to destroy secret orders before being captured. At the moment, your troops south of Rome are getting a kick in the nuts. Sorry. You poor nose pickers. Sign the German troops. And they're having a little fun. This is a flag that was captured. Soldier's Guide of Sicily, a flag that was captured during this time from the Italians. This is the American invasion of Italy. In Naples, they took a swastika down. They signed it, this whole group here. Kind of a souvenir. This is all courtesy of the National World War II Museum. Here's some of the stuff from the 10th Mountain Division who fought on skis and fought in the snow. This is the Monte Cassino attack, which is behind the Gothic Line, but it was poorly executed and it didn't go off well. And so here's kind of the whole Italian front going on at this time. And eventually, by the end of the war, the Americans are up here by the Po River Valley. This is breaking through the German defenses. September 1944 to May 1945, getting through the Gothic Line and pushing them much further north towards the end of the war. We have a picture here of Churchill and Roosevelt, who met quite a bit during the war to discuss strategy and where to attack next. And then finally, we're going to get to D-Day here. The invasion of France, known as Operation Overlord, supposed to happen June 5th, 1944. It actually happened on June 6th because of weather delays. It occurred in Normandy, France, which was a surprise because the Nazis expected it to be at Calais, which is much closer to Britain. Normandy was a little bit of a jaunt across the English Channel. In this single day, 2,499 Americans died. The initial invasion of D-Day, to establish the beachhead with no cover, to push the Germans back, to get rid of the pillboxes, the machine gun turrets, and to establish a beachhead for more and more troops and supplies to land. In all, 4,413 Allies died total. This is the largest amphibious invasion in the history of war. There's videos of it online. It's really good. There's fierce fighting, like we said. Within weeks, though, of establishing this beachhead, over 1 million troops had landed in France. If you've seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, it's excellent filmmaking, really well done. There's extremely tough fighting once they got into France. There's these hedgerows that they had to try to get through. The Nazis would funnel them through these giant rows of hedges that are 10, 12 feet high. They're hundreds of years old. The Allies came up with some pretty creative ways to get through them with flamethrowers and grenades, and sometimes the grenades didn't work, so they made teeth on the front of their tanks to cut holes in them. Here's some pictures from D-Day. This is D-Day plus, I don't know, probably a couple weeks. D-Day plus 14. So every day afterwards is D-Day plus 1 plus 2. This is the amount of materials coming across the channel for the invasion of France and to liberate Europe from the Nazis. In all, you can see this. There's 14,000 casualties. You have 6,300 ships. You have 10,440 aircraft. You have 153,000 men. You can see the amount of manpower it took to plan this. They invented boats. They invented things to plant bombs up into the pillboxes. It's just a remarkably meticulously planned invasion. And so, like I said, from Dover to Calais is the closest. It's about 30 miles across the channel. Instead, they attack here in Normandy. The Americans fought at Utah and Omaha Beach. The British landed at Gold and Sword Beach, and the Canadians fought on Juno Beach. To secure the flanks the night before, you had paratroopers who were there on the sides to make sure that this invasion went off without a hitch. Really good videos of this if you could check it out. Here's the Normandy Beachhead after D-Day. And then here after this is when they swing around, they consolidate their forces, and then push towards France. That's a little bit later. I got that a little bit out of order. I'm sorry about that. We're going to stop there. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know.